They dragged me out onto my own front lawn at 3 in the morning, and I let my knees buckle like an old man who'd finally lost his mind. My neighbors watched from behind their blinds. My daughter stood on the porch in her silk robe, filming on her phone. Her mouth curved into something that almost passed for grief. At the precinct, the detective flipped open a folder, read the second page, and went completely white. He looked up at the officer holding my arm and said, in a voice that cracked down the middle, "Get these cuffs off him, right now." Then he turned to me, hands trembling, and asked me a question I'd been waiting 3 months to answer. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 68 years old, and until 11 months ago, I believed my daughter loved me. I spent 31 years as a federal bank examiner, the kind of job nobody at a dinner party wants to hear about, tracking the money that criminals think is invisible. I retired with a good pension, a paid-off house in Asheville, North Carolina, and a daughter named Paige, who I thought had turned out just fine. Paige is 41. She married a man named Colton 9 years ago, a man who sells wealth strategies to people who don't understand what a Roth IRA is, and together they built a life that looked, from the outside, like the American dream. A 5-bedroom house in a gated development, a boat, 2 vacations a year they posted about like it was a full-time job. What none of the neighbors knew, what I didn't fully understand until 3 months before that night on my lawn, was that the dream was built on my name. It started at a birthday dinner, mine, 68th birthday, and Paige had organized the whole thing at a steakhouse downtown. Candles, a cake, the works. Colton stood up with a glass of wine halfway through dessert and made a toast about family and legacy, and how grateful they both were that I'd finally started trusting them with the big decisions. I remember smiling and nodding, because that's what you do. But under the table, I felt my jaw tighten, because I hadn't made any big decisions, not with them, not that I could remember. Later that night, back at my house, I couldn't sleep. Something about that toast sat wrong in my stomach, the way a lie sits wrong even before you know it's a lie. So I did what 31 years of training taught me to do. I checked. I logged into my brokerage account, the one that held what was left of my late wife Carol's life insurance money, almost $400,000 I'd never touched because it felt like touching her. There was a beneficiary change on file, filed 6 weeks earlier. My signature was on it, except I hadn't signed anything. I know my own signature the way I know my own face, and this one leaned wrong. The T crossed too high, the way somebody signs when they're copying you instead of being you. I sat in my kitchen at 1 in the morning with my reading glasses pushed up on my forehead, staring at that form, and I felt something in me go very cold and very quiet. I did not call Paige. I did not confront Colton. 31 years of chasing men who moved money in the dark taught me exactly one lesson that never failed. The moment you let a thief know you're onto them, they burn the evidence and build a new lie twice as clean. So I closed the laptop, and I decided I would become the fool they already thought I was. The next few weeks, I played my part well. I asked Paige simple questions about her life, the kind a lonely father asks because he wants to feel included. Colton's business, she said, was expanding into new markets. They were diversifying, a word she used like it meant something. I nodded along, sipping the coffee she brought me on Sunday visits, telling her how proud I was. Meanwhile, late at night, in the small office off my garage where I still kept an old encrypted drive from my working days, habits die hard for a man who spent 3 decades protecting other people's secrets. I started pulling threads. The forged beneficiary form was the first thread. The second came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday, when I couldn't sleep and went downstairs at 1:30 for a glass of water. I saw a light under the door of my home office, the room where I kept my old case files boxed up, useless paper nobody wanted anymore, or so I thought. I pushed the door open slowly, quietly, and there was Colton, sitting at my desk, my old laptop open, a USB drive plugged into the side of it, its little light blinking steady green. He jumped like he'd been electrocuted. Behind him, standing in the doorway to the hall closet where I kept old bank statements, was Paige, holding a flashlight, her face doing that thing faces do when they're deciding, in real time, how much of a lie they can get away with. "Dad," she said, "too fast, too bright. We didn't want to wake you. We're setting up a trust, a real one, to protect your assets from probate. Colton's just pulling your old account numbers so the lawyer can finalize everything before your birthday next month. It's a gift, Dad. We wanted to surprise you." Colton nodded along, holding up a stack of papers like a shield. "Estate planning documents, Walter. You know how complicated these federal forms get. We didn't want to bother you with it." It was a good lie. A generous man, a trusting man, a lonely widower starved for his daughter's attention, would have felt his chest go warm and soft at those words. He would have hugged them both and gone back to bed grateful. But I spent 31 years learning exactly how a lie moves across a human face. Paige's voice had climbed half an octave above where it normally sits. Her pupils were blown wide in a room lit only by a desk lamp and a laptop screen. More light than that room should have put into anybody's eyes, unless fear was doing the dilating. Colton's knuckles were bone white around that stack of papers, and his breath was coming shallow and high in his chest, the way a man breathes when his body knows something his mouth is still lying about. So I smiled. I told them it was the sweetest thing anyone had done for me since Carol passed. I told them to finish up, and I'd see them at breakfast. I shuffled back to bed like a tired old man grateful for his children, and I lay there in the dark with my heart pounding, because I had just watched my daughter and her husband steal the master password to every account I owned and dress it up as love. I did not sleep again that night, and I did not confront them in the morning. Instead, over pancakes, I asked easy questions and let them talk. Colton complained, unprompted, about how brutal the market had been for his clients this quarter, how he was barely keeping the lights on at the office, how stressful it all was. Paige nodded along with a look of practiced sympathy on her face. 4 days later, a brand new Range Rover, the kind that starts at $90,000 before you add anything, pulled into my daughter's driveway with temporary dealer tags. No trade-in, no financing paperwork visible in the glove box when I accidentally glanced inside during a visit. A cash purchase, or close enough to it, from a man who'd just told me, 4 days earlier, that he was barely scraping by. The math didn't work. And once the math stops working, 31 years of training tells you exactly one thing. Someone is lying about where the money's really coming from. That night, I went down to the little converted room behind my garage, the one Paige and Colton didn't know still had a working line into the house's network, an old habit from a career spent building systems nobody else could see. I traced the traffic from the night they'd been in my office. It didn't take long to find what I already suspected in my gut. There had been an intrusion into my brokerage account, a slow, patient one, spread out over almost 2 months, using my old case file laptop as the entry point. The money hadn't just been redirected on paper. Small transfers, careful ones, staying under the amounts that trigger automatic bank flags, had already been moving. Not to Paige's checking account, not to Colton's business. The trail ran through 2 shell companies I'd never heard of, and ended, every single time, at an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under a name I did recognize. Colton's business partner, a man named Reeve Ashford, someone Paige had introduced to me once at a Christmas party as just an investor. I sat in that dim little room with the hum of the old server rack behind me, and I understood, fully, for the first time, that this wasn't a lapse in judgment or a moment of financial panic. This was a plan. My daughter and her husband had spent months building a case against a version of me that didn't exist. An old man losing his grip, easy to manipulate, easy to steal from, easy to eventually have declared incompetent if it came to that. And once they realized I might notice the missing money before the trust paperwork was finalized, I understood exactly what would come next. They would need me discredited, removed, arrested, even, if it meant a judge would sign away control of what remained. So instead of running, I built a trap of my own. I spent the next several weeks doing something I hadn't done since I retired. Real work. I quietly moved what genuine assets I still controlled into accounts they didn't know existed, protected under language. Even a good lawyer would take a week to untangle. And then, carefully, patiently, I left a door open. I let one account, a decoy, sit there looking exactly like the kind of vulnerable, poorly protected fund a greedy son-in-law would love to drain in one final move before pulling the trigger on whatever plan they had for me. I salted it with just enough real-looking money to be tempting, and I wired it through a federal monitoring system I still had contacts to access. Quietly, off the books, thanks to old friends who owed me favors from 3 decades of cleaning up other people's messes. I did not have to wait long. 3 weeks later, at 2 in the morning, they made their move. I woke up to my own bedroom door being kicked off its hinges, flashlights cutting through the dark, voices screaming for me to show my hands, to get on the ground. I am 68 years old, My hip has 3 screws in it from a fall 4 years back, and the officer who wrenched my arm behind my back didn't care. I didn't fight. I didn't ask for a lawyer. I let them cuff me and march me barefoot across my own gravel driveway, and there, in the flashing red and blue, was my daughter, in her robe, phone raised, filming her own father being dragged out of his house in handcuffs, and not one tear on her face. Just that small, satisfied curl at the corner of her mouth. Behind her stood Colton, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. At the precinct, they put me in a cold little room with a metal table and a buzzing light overhead. A detective named Ruiz came in carrying a folder thick enough to look serious. He sat down across from me and told me, with the tired confidence of a man who thinks he already knows how this ends, that I was being charged with elder financial fraud against my own family, that Page and Colton had filed a report alleging I had been draining accounts meant for their children's education, moving money into secretive offshore holdings, that there was a pattern of erratic, paranoid behavior consistent with early dementia, according to a doctor's letter they'd apparently arranged. He slid a printed transaction log across the table and asked if I had anything to say. I told him to look deeper into my file. Not the surface one, the real one. He frowned, annoyed, the way men get when an old man doesn't act scared enough. He typed my name and social security number into the federal database, and I watched his face change in real time, the way I'd once watched it change on men twice his size across tables just like this one. His scrolling slowed. Stopped. He leaned in close to the screen, and the color drained clean out of his face like someone had pulled a plug. He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor, and he shouted at the officers by the door to remove my cuffs immediately. "Mr. Greer," he said, his voice barely holding steady. Once the steel was off my wrists, and I was rubbing the ache back into them. "This file says you spent 31 years as a senior federal bank examiner. It says you personally helped design half the fraud detection protocols this bureau still runs on." He looked at the folder his own department had built against me, then back at my face. "Why would a man like you be framed for something this sloppy?" I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, and asked him to turn his laptop toward me. "Because I let them think I was an old fool," I said. "And now, I'm going to show you exactly where my money actually went tonight, detective. Because they just wired $800,000 into an account I built for this exact moment 3 months ago, and every dollar of it is federally flagged." Ruiz's mouth opened and nothing came out for a second. I walked him through it slowly, patiently, the way I used to walk junior agents through a case file back when I still had a badge. The decoy account, the shell companies, the offshore trail to Reeve Ashford in the Caymans, a man who, it turned out, was already under a separate federal investigation for laundering money through exactly this kind of small, harmless family fraud scheme, dozens of them, all across the Southeast, using trusted, aging relatives as unwitting front accounts. My daughter and her husband hadn't just stolen from me. They'd handed a federal task force the missing piece of a much larger case they'd been building for over a year. Ruiz sat back down slowly, the exhaustion in his shoulders replaced by something sharper. "You knew," he said. "You knew this whole time, and you let them keep going." "I needed the full picture," I told him. "You don't stop a flood by plugging one hole. You wait until you can see the whole dam." We drove back to my daughter's neighborhood together, Ruiz behind the wheel, me in the passenger seat, watching the sun start to come up over the pines. He'd already made the calls. Federal agents were converging on Page and Colton's house before we even turned onto their street. Through the tracking feed still open on my phone, I watched what happened next unfold, almost like a movie I already knew the ending to. Page and Colton were in their kitchen, champagne open on the counter, celebrating, I would later learn, because they believed the judge overseeing the emergency guardianship petition they'd filed against me would rule in their favor by that afternoon. They thought they'd won. They thought the money was already as good as theirs. They had no idea that the very account they'd just drained belonged to a federal sting, or that Reeve Ashford, 3 states away, was already in an interview room admitting everything to save himself a longer sentence. The tactical team didn't knock. The front door came off its hinges with a sound like a gunshot, and Paige's champagne glass hit the tile and shattered before she even finished screaming. Colton tried to run for the garage and made it exactly 4 steps before 2 agents had him on the ground, his cheek pressed into his own imported marble floor, his $400 loafers scraping uselessly against the tile. "Do something," he screamed at his lawyer, who'd been called over that morning to celebrate the guardianship ruling and instead found himself watching his client get zip-tied on his own kitchen floor. "I'm paying you good money, tell them to stop." The lawyer didn't move. An agent shoved the warrant into his hands, and I watched, through the grainy feed, the exact moment the man's face went the color of old paper. Whatever was written on that warrant, wire fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy, and a direct financial tie to an active federal money laundering case, was enough to make a $500 an hour attorney take 3 steps back and announce, right there in the wreckage of the front hallway, that his firm would not be representing either of them going forward. Colton looked up from the floor, tears streaking down into the grout lines of his own kitchen tile, and found my daughter's eyes instead of mine, because I wasn't even in the room. I was 2 miles away, in the passenger seat of an unmarked car, watching all of it happen on a 5-inch screen, and I felt, God help me, nothing. No triumph, no grief, just a kind of quiet, exhausted stillness. The way you feel when you finally set down something heavy you've been carrying so long, your arms forgot what it felt like to be empty. Paige was arrested 20 minutes later, still in her robe, the same one she'd worn while filming me in handcuffs on my own lawn. I did not go inside the house. I sat in the car and watched them lead her out, and for 1/2 of 1 second, our eyes met across the driveway, and I saw, finally, something honest on her face. Not anger, fear, the real kind. 6 months passed before the sentencing. The federal case against Reeve Ashford ended up sweeping in 11 other families across 3 states, all of them elderly parents whose own children had been recruited, coached, sometimes even paid, to gaslight and defraud them out of retirement savings using almost identical playbooks. Colton took a plea deal and got 9 years. Paige fought it, insisted at every hearing that I had manipulated the entire situation, that I had set her up, as if catching your own child in the act of destroying you is somehow the crime. The judge did not agree. She was sentenced to 11 years for conspiracy to commit fraud and elder financial abuse, and I sat in the 3rd row of that courtroom in my one good suit and did not look away once. Not when she cried, not when she looked back at me and mouthed the word please. I have thought many times since then about what I owed her in that moment. I have decided the answer is nothing. I gave her 41 years of a father's love before she decided I was worth more to her broken than whole. The $800,000 was returned to me in full once the case closed, along with roughly $2 million more the federal investigation recovered from Ashford's network. My share of what they determined had been siphoned specifically through the fraudulent trust documents bearing my forged signature. I didn't want it sitting in an account reminding me every month of how it got there. So I did something with it instead. I sold the house in Asheville, the one Carol and I bought together 30 years ago, the one Paige grew up in, and I used a portion of the recovered money to set up a foundation. Small, quiet, no press releases, that helps elderly people navigate exactly what almost happened to me. Forged documents, coerced guardianship petitions, family members who mistake an aging parent's trust for an aging parent's stupidity. We've already helped build cases for 6 families in North Carolina alone, and I sit on the board, not for glory, but because I know exactly what it costs a person to sit in a cold room and realize their own child helped build the walls closing in around them. I live now in a small cabin outside Boone, up in the mountains. Nothing fancy, just quiet. Some evenings I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the fog roll down off the ridge, and I think about the boy I used to be before any of this, the young father who used to carry Paige on his shoulders through the state fair so she could see over the crowds. I don't know exactly when that boy turned into the man sitting alone in a cabin who had to trap his own daughter into a federal indictment to survive her. I don't know if that man could have done anything differently. I've stopped asking. What I know now, the thing I'd tell any one of you listening tonight, if you were sitting across from me instead of just hearing my voice, is this. Love is not the same thing as safety. A parent can give everything, every ounce of themselves, every dollar, every Saturday, every ounce of patience, and it still might not be enough to stop the people closest to you from deciding you're worth more broken than whole. And if that ever happens to you, if you ever catch that look on someone's face, that half-second flash of calculation instead of love, do not talk yourself out of what your gut already knows. Watch. Wait. Build your case quietly, because the people who taught me the most about protecting myself were never the criminals I chased for 31 years across 100 case files. They were sitting at my own dinner table the whole time.